The entire town laughed and told him the mountain would kill him. A broke old veteran in a red and black flannel jacket moved into ancient stone ruins outside Durango, Colorado, hoping only to survive one more winter in peace. But when his loyal German shepherd began digging at a wall that didn't belong, he uncovered something hidden for over a century. What lay behind that stone wasn't just a forgotten shelter. It was knowledge powerful enough to keep a man alive when the cold takes everything else. And once the truth came out, the laughter in town didn't just stop. It turned into silence. Before we go on, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Snow fell thick and soundless over the San Juan Mountains, pressing the town of Durango into a white, breath-stealing silence. Frank Walker arrived just before dusk, his old pickup coughing as it climbed the last narrow road toward the abandoned stone ruins above town. He was 67, tall but slightly stooped, with the kind of posture that came not from age alone but from years of carrying weight that never truly left the shoulders. His face was sharply angled, weather-cut, with a jaw that looked as if it had once been carved from certainty and later worn down by time. A gray-white beard covered most of his cheeks and chin, trimmed short out of habit rather than vanity, and deep lines ran from the corners of his eyes to his temples, creases earned from squinting into sun snow, and situations where hesitation could cost lives. Over everything he wore the same thing he had worn every winter since leaving the service, a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, heavy enough to feel like armor, familiar enough to feel like skin. In the passenger seat sat Rex, a German shepherd, pushing 11 years old, his black and tan coat dusted with snow that had melted and refrozen into tiny crystals. His muzzle had begun to gray, but his posture was still alert, ears, upright amber eyes scanning the darkening slope with quiet focus. Rex had the steady presence of a dog that had seen chaos and learned not to panic. He was broad-chested, scarred lightly along one hind leg from an old injury Frank never spoke about, and he moved with a calm confidence that made people step aside without realizing why. Rex did not bark much. When he did, it mattered. The ruins sat just above the tree line, a scatter of thick stone walls half buried by decades of snow, wind, and neglect. To the people of Durango, they were nothing more than a curiosity, leftovers from some failed settlement no one bothered to remember. To Frank, they were shelter, not comfort, not hope. Shelter was enough. He parked near the edge of the slope and cut the engine. The silence rushed in immediately, broken only by wind whispering through pines and the distant creak of frozen branches. Frank sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. He had learned long ago that the first moments in a new place mattered. You listened. You paid attention. You let the place tell you what it was. Below, the town lights of Durango flickered faintly, warm and distant, like something belonging to another life. He had been there earlier that afternoon, loading the last of his supplies from a hardware store on Main Avenue. That was where the laughter had started. It hadn't been cruel, not exactly. More puzzled than anything. At the counter, Sarah Miller had watched him from beneath the brim of her knit cap, curiosity written openly across her face. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and slim, with ash-blonde hair pulled into a low ponytail and skin pale from winters spent indoors. She had the posture of someone used to standing all day, and the tired eyes of someone who had learned to be kind even when it cost effort. When Frank mentioned where he was headed, her hands had paused mid-movement. "You mean the old stone place?" she'd asked, eyebrows lifting. "Up past Junction Creek." Frank had nodded once. That was his way. She'd hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice as if the walls might overhear. "People don't stay up there in winter." Others had joined in, then an older man with a beer gut and a red nose from the cold a younger clerk who tried and failed to hide his grin. Someone had muttered, "That place'll freeze you solid." Another had laughed outright. Frank had felt it roll over him without sticking. He'd heard worse in harsher places. Sarah at least had looked concerned rather than amused. "You sure about this?" she'd asked. "It gets brutal." Frank had met her eyes. There was no defiance there, no bravado. Just certainty. "I'm sure," he'd said, voice low and even. Now standing among the ruins, he pulled his flannel tighter and let Rex jump down from the truck. The dog moved slowly, deliberately, nose close to the ground, taking in scents buried beneath years of frost and stone. Frank grabbed his pack, 40 pounds give or take, and slung it over one shoulder. His knees protested, but he ignored them. Pain was just information. The ruins revealed themselves gradually as his eyes adjusted. 3 walls stood nearly full height, thick granite blocks fitted together with a precision that modern builders rarely bothered with. The 4th wall had collapsed long ago, leaving an opening that faced south toward the valley. Snow had drifted in deep along the edges, but the interior felt muted. The wind that howled freely outside seemed to lose interest here, sliding past instead of cutting through. Frank stepped inside and stopped. He didn't smile. He didn't relax. He simply noticed. The air felt different. Not warm, no one would call it that, but less hostile, less sharp. He set his pack down and rested his gloved hand against the stone. It was cold, but not biting. Dense, solid, the kind of cold that stored memory rather than stealing heat outright. Rex padded in behind him and circled once before sitting near the north wall, back straight, eyes forward. Comfortable. That more than anything told Frank he hadn't made a mistake. From his coat pocket, he pulled out the folded paper he'd carried for years. It was brittle at the creases, the ink faded and smudged. A rough sketch of stone walls, arrows marking directions, notes written in a hand he recognized better than his own. His father's hand. A man who had survived a different war, a different winter, and had come home quieter than before. Frank had found the paper tucked inside a toolbox after the funeral, along with a single note written in the margin, barely legible. "Warm here." At the time, Frank hadn't understood. He hadn't tried to. Life had still been loud, then work noise, expectations, a marriage that ended without shouting, but left behind a silence heavier than anger. Then the job disappeared. The pension stretched thinner than promised. Friends drifted. Cities began to feel like enclosed spaces with invisible walls. The mountain had not laughed when he arrived. It hadn't welcomed him either. It had simply existed. Frank began setting up for the night with practiced efficiency. He cleared snow, anchored his small tent against the 2 tallest walls, and positioned his gear where the stone blocked the wind. Rex watched occasionally, standing to sniff the air, before settling again, as if approving each choice. As darkness settled fully, the temperature dropped fast outside. Frank could feel it through the soles of his boots when he stepped beyond the walls. Inside, the change was slower, subtle, noticeable only to someone paying attention. He sat down heavily on a crate and exhaled breath fogging in front of his face. For the first time that day, his shoulders lowered a fraction. The laughter from town echoed faintly in his memory, already losing shape. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He understood why they laughed. People laughed when something didn't fit their rules. Rex moved closer and lay down beside him, pressing his solid weight against Frank's leg. The dog's warmth seeped through layers of denim and wool, steady and real. Frank rested his hand on Rex's broad head, fingers tracing familiar scars and thick fur. "Yeah," he murmured, barely louder than the wind. "We'll be fine." Outside, snow continued to fall, burying the path back to town inch by inch. Inside the ancient stone walls, the cold waited, but it did not rush in. Frank Walker had come here expecting nothing more than survival. He did not yet know that the mountain had already begun answering him. The night deepened slowly, the kind of mountain darkness that did not fall all at once but settled layer by layer, thickening as the temperature dropped and the wind found its voice among the pines. Frank Walker woke sometime after midnight, not startled, not afraid, but alert in the way only years of training could produce. His eyes opened to blackness, his breath slow, and measured, his hand instinctively reaching toward the place where a rifle would have been once decades ago. Instead, it rested against rough stone. Cold stone, yet not as cold as it should have been. That realization came to him fully awake. The air inside the ruins was still biting, sharp enough to sting his lungs when he inhaled too deeply, but it lacked the savage edge he knew well. Outside these walls at this altitude, with the wind screaming down from the San Juans, the cold should have been relentless. Instead, here it lingered. It hesitated. Frank shifted slightly inside his sleeping bag and listened. The wind passed over the southern opening, but did not rush in. It slid along the outer stone like water around a submerged rock. He had slept in worse places, foxholes flooded with icy rain, temporary shelters scraped together from scrap metal, and broken doors, concrete bunkers that trapped cold like a grudge. This was different. This place behaved as if it understood winter and had learned not to fight it head-on. Frank exhaled slowly, a faint cloud blooming in the dim beam of his headlamp, and reached out again, pressing his palm flat against the granite wall. The stone was dense solid, holding something invisible but undeniable. Heat. Not warmth in the comforting sense, but stored memory of the day's thin sunlight, absorbed patiently and released with restraint. It reminded him of men he'd served with, quiet ones, never loud, never flashy, but reliable when things turned bad. Rex lay pressed against his right leg, the dog's broad flank rising and falling in a steady rhythm. At 11 years old, Rex no longer slept as deeply as he once had. His ears twitched at every distant sound, every subtle change in the wind's tone, but he did not move. His body radiated warmth through Frank's jeans, a living counterpoint to the stone's slow, impersonal heat. Rex's coat was thickest along his shoulders, and chest coarse black fur layered over dense undercoat, built for exactly this kind of environment. Frank had always suspected the dog felt more at home here than he ever had in town. Rex belonged to wide spaces and silence. Sidewalks and fences had never made sense to him. Frank sat up carefully, joints stiff but obedient, and checked the small thermometer clipped to his pack. The red line hovered just above freezing. Outside, he knew without checking, it would be well below zero by now. 20 degrees, maybe more. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but didn't quite make it. Whoever had built this place hadn't done so blindly. They'd known the mountain, known the sun's path, the wind's cruelty, the way cold crept in through carelessness rather than force. He thought of his father, then uninvited but persistent. A man built from angles and silence, with hands permanently scarred from work and war. His father had never explained where he learned the things he knew: how to find shelter, where others saw none, how to read terrain the way some men read books. Frank remembered a winter when he was 16, stranded with his father during a blizzard while hauling scrap through the Rockies. They'd taken refuge against a rock face, building a crude windbreak from stone and canvas. Frank had complained about the cold until his father fixed him with a look sharp enough to cut. "Cold's always there," the man had said. "It only wins if you invite it." Frank had invited nothing tonight. Near dawn, Rex stirred. His ears lifted fully now, head turning toward the western wall. He rose to his feet with deliberate care and moved away from Frank, nose lowering to the ground. Frank watched without speaking. He trusted Rex's instincts more than his own in unfamiliar places. The dog sniffed along the base of the stonework tail, still muscles taut beneath his fur. There was no growling, no alarm, just focus. Curiosity sharpened into intent. "What is it?" Frank murmured, voice barely louder than breath. Rex paused near the far corner where snow had drifted shallowly against the wall. He pawed once at the ground, then again scraping frost-hardened soil aside. Frank frowned and pushed himself upright, pulling on his boots. As he approached, he noticed something subtle. One block of stone near the base didn't match the others. Its color leaned warmer, faintly reddish against the cold, gray granite surrounding it. The difference was slight, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Frank knelt, despite the protest in his knees, and brushed snow away with a gloved hand. The block was smoother than the rest, and it wasn't mortared in. He didn't remove it. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back, studying the wall as a whole. Whoever had built this had been precise, intentional. Nothing here was accidental. The presence of one stone that didn't belong suggested purpose, not decay. Frank felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation of standing at the edge of something unfinished, something waiting. By mid-morning, pale sunlight filtered through the southern opening, striking the interior stones at a low angle. The effect was immediate. The walls brightened not with color, but with presence, as if waking from a long sleep. Frank brewed coffee over a small stove, careful to keep the flame low, and watched steam curl upward and vanish. Outside, the wind scoured the slope, carrying fine snow like sand. Inside, the air remained almost calm. He thought of Durango then, of the laughter, of Sarah Miller's concerned eyes. Sarah had stayed with him longer than the others. That afternoon, her hands folded around a paper cup, as if warming more than her fingers. She'd been kind but cautious, a woman shaped by routine and responsibility, with straight shoulders and a practical kindness that didn't assume it could fix anything. Frank doubted she'd ever stand this high in winter by choice, and yet he suspected she'd understand more than she let on. The thought surprised him. Rex returned to the wall and sniffed again, insistently this time, then looked back at Frank. The dog's amber eyes held something close to expectation. Frank nodded once. Later he said, "We'll see what you found." The mountain did not rush him. The stone did not demand. The cold waited outside, patient and confident, certain it would eventually have its turn. Frank finished his coffee and stood shoulders squaring beneath the weight of his flannel jacket. He ran his hand once more over the granite wall, feeling the quiet strength beneath his palm. This place wasn't magic. It was knowledge. Hard-earned, forgotten knowledge set into stone by hands that understood survival better than comfort. He didn't yet know who those hands belonged to, but he was beginning to understand why they had built this way, and why they had chosen to stay. Frank waited until the sun had climbed high enough to soften the frost before he acted, because impatience was how men got hurt, and he had learned long ago that mountains punished haste without apology. Rex had not stopped returning to the western wall since dawn, circling it with the quiet insistence of a creature certain of what it sensed, but willing to wait for permission. The dog's paws scraped lightly at the frozen ground, not frantic, not playful, but purposeful, his broad shoulders rolling beneath his thick coat as he worked the same narrow strip of earth again and again. Frank studied the wall with narrowed eyes, tracing the lines of the stonework, the way a mechanic read an engine block. Most of the granite blocks were uniform in color, and cut weathered to the same dull gray by time and snow, but the stone Rex fixated on stood out once you knew how to look for it. It was warmer in hue, faintly reddish-brown, its surface smoother, its edges too clean, as if it had come from somewhere else entirely. Sandstone, Frank thought, not native to this slope. Someone had carried it here deliberately. He knelt with a controlled grunt, the cold biting through his jeans, and pressed his fingers into the narrow seam around the block. No mortar, just gravity and careful placement. That alone told him enough. This wasn't decay. This was design. Rex stepped back when Frank leaned in closer, ears upright, amber eyes fixed on his face, waiting. Frank gave a short nod, the same signal he'd used years ago, in places where words carried too far. He wedged his fingers into the gap and pulled. The stone resisted at first, then shifted with a low grinding sound that echoed softly inside the ruins. Frank braced his boots and eased it free inch by inch, muscles tightening beneath the flannel breath, steady, controlled. When the block finally came loose, he set it carefully aside instead of letting it fall. What opened behind it was darkness deeper than shadow, a rectangular hollow carved into the thickness of the wall. Cold air spilled out, carrying a dry, dusty scent untouched by moisture. Frank reached in slowly and felt fabric stiff but intact. He withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, yellowed and cracked with age, but still doing its job. Inside were papers, not just a few. Dozens. Letters folded and stacked with care, along with a single leather-bound notebook whose spine was worn smooth by years of handling. Frank did not open anything right away. He sat back on his heels and looked at Rex, who had settled beside him, tail still, posture alert but calm, as if the dog understood this was not prey but history. "Good work," Frank said quietly, his voice rougher than he intended. Rex's ears flicked once, satisfied. Frank carried the bundle into the center of the shelter and laid it on a flattened crate, brushing off grit with hands that had disarmed explosives and stitched wounds, but now moved with something closer to reverence. He unwrapped the oilcloth slowly, mindful of brittle paper, and unfolded the top letter. The handwriting was neat, slanted slightly, right, confident, without flourish. The ink had faded, but remained legible, the words anchored firmly to the page. The name at the bottom caught his breath before the words did. Elias Monroe. Frank sat back, the name settling into him with an unexpected weight. He had known men named Monroe. Solid men. Quiet men. Men who survived wars and came home changed in ways no one wanted to talk about. He began to read, not skimming, not rushing, but letting each sentence land. The letters spoke of winter, of isolation, of deliberate choices made when easier paths were available but wrong. Elias wrote of coming to these mountains after the war, of finding the ruins already old, even then of recognizing something in the stone that others dismissed as dead weight. He described learning the land, the way he once learned enemy terrain, studying wind patterns, sun angles, snowfall behavior, not to conquer, but to coexist. Frank recognized the mindset instantly. This was not the writing of a dreamer or a hermit driven mad by solitude. This was the voice of a soldier who had grown tired of chaos and chosen discipline of a different kind. The notebook filled in what the letters hinted at. Diagrams sketched in pencil showed wall orientations, arrows marking prevailing winds, notes on stone density and thickness. Elias wrote about thermal mass not as theory, but as lived truth, explaining how thick stone absorbed the weak winter sun and released it slowly through the night, how blocking wind mattered more than fighting cold, how a south-facing opening could mean the difference between endurance and death. Frank felt a tightness in his chest as he turned the pages. These were lessons he had learned the hard way, in other places, scribbled now by a man who had clearly done the same. Elias wrote about being laughed at by people in the valley, about being called stubborn, strange, broken. He did not sound bitter. He sounded resolved. As the afternoon wore on, light shifted across the interior walls, and Frank realized the temperature inside the shelter was holding steady despite the sharp drop outside. He read until his eyes ached, until the sun slid low, and Rex rose to stretch his joints, cracking softly. That was when Frank heard footsteps crunching through snow beyond the southern opening. He looked up sharply, instincts flaring, and rose in one smooth motion. Rex moved to his side, body angled forward, silent but unmistakably present. Sarah Miller stood just outside the threshold, hands shoved deep into her coat pockets, breath fogging in the cold air. In daylight, she looked smaller than she had in town, her tall, slender frame dwarfed by the ruins and the mountains behind them. Her ash-blonde hair was tucked beneath a wool hat, a few loose strands catching the light, her pale skin flushed pink from the climb. She hesitated when she saw Frank standing there, flannel jacket stark against the stone, Rex looming at his side like a shadow given form. "I wasn't sure I'd find you," she said, voice steady but cautious. "I followed the tracks." Frank studied her for a moment, weighing risk and courtesy. Sarah was not dressed like a tourist. Her boots were worn but practical, her movements careful, respectful of the terrain. Concern, not curiosity, had brought her here. "You shouldn't have come up alone," he said finally. She shrugged a small, tight motion. "I've lived here long enough to know how to move in snow." Her eyes flicked to the open notebook on the crate, then back to him. "People are talking," she added. "They say you stayed the night, when the temperature dropped that hard." Frank didn't answer immediately. He stepped aside just enough to let her see the interior of the shelter. Sarah crossed the threshold and stopped short, her expression shifting from skepticism to confusion to something like awe. She pulled off her gloves and rubbed her hands together, then frowned. "It's warmer," she said quietly. Not a question. Frank nodded once. She looked around slowly, fingers brushing the stone wall the way his had, as if testing reality. How, she asked. Frank glanced at the notebook, then at the reddish sandstone block resting nearby. "Someone knew what they were doing," he said. Sarah didn't laugh. She didn't question him further. She just stood there, absorbing the space, her practical mind recalibrating. For the first time since arriving, Frank felt something shift, not in the mountain, but between him and the world below. Elias Monroe had built more than shelter here. He had left proof. Frank read Elias Monroe's letters aloud that evening, not because Sarah asked him to, but because the words seemed to demand air sound and witness. The stone walls caught his voice and returned, it softened, steadied as if the place itself approved of being remembered properly. Outside, the wind rose and fell in restless waves, but inside the ruins, the air remained almost calm. Sarah sat on a low crate near the southern opening, knees pulled slightly inward, gloved hands wrapped around a metal cup Frank had filled with hot water. In the flickering light of the lantern, her face looked sharper than it had in town, cheekbones, pronounced eyes, thoughtful and serious. She was a woman accustomed to listening more than speaking, her kindness practical rather than sentimental, shaped by years of watching people struggle quietly through winters that were never gentle. Her ash-blonde hair had slipped loose from beneath her hat and fell in uneven strands along her pale cheeks, catching the warm glow in a way that made her look both fragile and unexpectedly strong. Frank paused between pages, his thumb resting on a line Elias had underlined twice. "They called him the Stone Man," Frank said, voice low. "Said he'd lost his mind up here. He did not need to explain why the name stuck." Sarah nodded slowly. She had heard similar stories growing up in Durango, warnings disguised as jokes, caution delivered through laughter. "People don't like what they can't explain," she said. "It makes them nervous." Her voice carried no judgment, only observation. Frank turned another page. Elias had written about winters that killed cattle in the valley, while he slept warm against stone walls about burning 4 cords of wood, when others burned 10 and still shivered. He wrote of neighbors shaking their heads at him, in summer markets men with red faces and thick gloves who dismissed his methods as luck or madness. Frank felt something tighten in his chest as he read not sorrow, not anger, but recognition. He had stood in rooms full of men who laughed at caution, who mocked preparation until it saved their lives. He had watched discipline dismissed as weakness by people who had never needed it. Rex lay stretched near the western wall, his body fully relaxed now, chin resting on his paws, tail still. The dog no longer lifted his head at each gust of wind or distant crack of ice. His breathing was slow and even, the breath of an animal that had accepted this place without question. Frank noticed it and felt the subtle shift it caused in him. Rex had decided. That mattered. Sarah leaned forward slightly as Frank read another passage, one describing how Elias learned to stop fighting the mountain and start listening to it. "He writes like a soldier," she said quietly. Frank looked up at her surprised, then nodded. "He is one," he replied. Or was. Sarah considered that, her gaze drifting to the walls, to the thick stone that held their warmth. "So people laughed," she said. "And he stayed anyway." Frank closed the notebook gently. "They laughed," he said, "because leaving would have meant admitting he was right." Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick flakes tapping softly against stone. Sarah rose and walked closer to the northern wall, running her fingers over the rough surface, her breath fogging faintly in the lantern light. "You know," she said, after a moment, "my grandfather used to say, 'The cold isn't cruel. People are. The cold just doesn't care.'" Frank looked at her more closely then. There was history there, too. Loss, perhaps. Endurance, the kind that didn't announce itself. They spoke little after that, but when Sarah left, she did not rush. At the threshold, she paused, meeting Frank's eyes. "People will start coming up here," she said. "Not today, not tomorrow, but they will." Frank shrugged, the motion slow and deliberate. "That's their choice." Sarah hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You're not what they think," she said. Frank did not ask who she meant. That night, alone again, Frank reread the final pages of Elias's notebook. The writing grew shakier near the end, but the certainty never left. Elias wrote of growing older, of bones aching, of climbing the ridge taking longer each year, but also of peace, of knowing he had chosen his life deliberately rather than letting fear or ridicule shape it. Frank set the notebook aside and stared into the dark, the words echoing through him like distant artillery he could no longer hear but still felt in his bones. Memories surfaced unbidden, the way laughter sounded before an ambush, the way mockery filled barracks before men learned what winter could do to unprepared bodies. Frank had outlived many of those men, not because he was braver, but because he listened, because he observed, because he adapted. He wondered, not for the first time, why those qualities were so often mistaken for weakness. Rex shifted closer during the night, pressing his weight more firmly against Frank's leg. The dog dreamed paws twitching slightly, a low sound rumbling in his chest that might have been a growl once but now settled into silence. Frank rested his hand on Rex's broad back and felt the steady warmth there, animal and immediate. He thought of Elias alone in these walls decades earlier, laughed at, dismissed, but alive. He thought of himself arriving here with nothing but supplies, discipline, and a dog who trusted him absolutely. By morning, the storm had thickened. Snow buried the path Sarah had taken down, erasing her tracks completely. Frank stood at the southern opening watching White swallow the world beyond a few dozen yards. Inside, the air remained tolerable steady. The stone walls did not care who laughed below. They held what they were given: heat, time, intention. Frank made his decision without ceremony. He would stay through the winter, not to prove anything, not to teach lessons, but because this place made sense in a way the valley no longer did. He folded Elias's letters carefully and placed them back in the oilcloth, tucking the bundle into his pack, as if safeguarding something of. Rex rose beside him, stretching tail, wagging once slow and confident. "Yeah," Frank said quietly. "I know." Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere far below, people went about their lives laughing at what they did not yet understand. Frank Walker did not announce his decision to stay through the winter. He simply stayed. Days passed, then nights, then storms layered over storms, and the ruins above Durango became less a temporary refuge and more a living structure shaped by deliberate effort. Frank moved with the patience of a man who understood that survival was not built in moments of inspiration, but in hundreds of small, correct choices made without witnesses. He thickened the northern wall, first hauling additional stone from a nearby collapse, each block chosen for density rather than size, fitted by hand, until no blade of wind could find its way through. His movements were slow, economical, guided by Elias Munro's sketches and notes, but refined by his own experience how cold crept low before it rose, how wind tested corners before it tested doors, how heat fled upward unless asked politely to remain. Rex followed him constantly, a shadow of muscle and fur, 11 years old now, but still powerful, his black and tan coat blending into the stone and timber like something grown rather than owned. The dog carried small stones when Frank allowed it, set his body against shifting blocks, and stood watch during long hours of quiet labor, ears tuned to the mountain's moods. Frank reshaped the southern opening next, narrowing it just enough to reduce exposure while preserving the sun's path. He built a crude vestibule using salvaged timber and stone, creating an air buffer Elias had written about, but never fully drawn. It was not elegant. It did not need to be. It worked. By the third week, when the temperature outside dropped so low, the air itself seemed brittle. Frank noticed the change immediately. Inside the shelter, his breath still fogged, but his fingers no longer numbed within minutes. The thermometer hovered stubbornly above freezing, even on nights when the wind screamed like a living thing, and the snow piled high enough to swallow Rex's tracks by morning. Frank burned less wood than he expected. 4 cords, just as Elias had written. Discipline rewarded discipline. Word traveled downward the way it always did, slow at first, then all at once. It began with Sarah Miller, who returned with supplies one morning, her tall, slender frame wrapped in a heavy parka, ash-blonde hair tucked beneath a fur-lined hood. Her pale skin was wind-reddened, her eyes sharper than before, curiosity tempered now by something like respect. She stayed longer this time, watching Frank work, asking careful questions. Sarah was not a woman given to superstition. She preferred explanations that could be tested, touched, repeated. When she stepped inside the shelter and felt the difference, truly felt it, her mouth pressed into a thin line as her mind recalibrated. "It shouldn't be this warm," she said quietly. Frank shrugged. "It is," he replied. She nodded, accepting the answer without argument. Then came others. Not crowds. Not yet. First was Tom Bennett, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a graying beard and a limp earned decades earlier in a logging accident. Tom had laughed the loudest back in town. Now he climbed the slope alone, boots crunching uncertainly, hat pulled low. He did not apologize. He did not need to. He stood inside the ruins, hands shoved into his coat pockets, eyes wide as the cold failed to bite. "Hell," he muttered. That was all. He left quietly and did not laugh again. After him came a young couple, faces raw with cold, their curiosity outweighing their skepticism. Then an older woman whose name Frank never learned, bundled in layers, eyes sharp and assessing, who ran her fingers along the stone and nodded, as if confirming something she had always suspected. Frank did not lecture. He did not explain thermal mass or wind deflection unless asked, and even then he spoke briefly, plainly, without flourish. He let the walls speak. He let the warmth do the convincing. Rex greeted visitors politely, but remained close to Frank, his presence a silent boundary. The dog had changed too. His earlier restlessness was gone, replaced by an easy confidence. He no longer barked at the wind or paced during storms. He slept deeply now, curled against stone that held heat the way fur held breath. This place had become territory, home. As winter deepened, the laughter below thinned until it disappeared entirely. No one mocked what they now came to see with their own eyes. Conversations shifted from jokes to questions. How did he build it? How did he know? Frank answered only what mattered. "Someone showed me," he said once, resting his hand against the wall. He did not say Elias's name often. He did not need to. The knowledge lived here now passed not through words, but through experience. On the coldest night of January, when the temperature dropped so far below zero that even the stars seemed brittle, Frank woke to silence rather than wind. Snow pressed heavily against the shelter, insulating it further, turning the world outside into a white void. Inside, the air hovered just above survivable, steady, stubborn. Frank lay awake, listening to Rex's breathing slow and even, and felt a calm he had not known in years. He thought of the men he had served with, some gone, some lost, long before death. He thought of Elias Monroe, alone but not lonely, writing by lamplight, trusting that someone someday would understand. He thought of the town below, of Sarah's thoughtful eyes, of Tom Bennett's quiet nod. The mountain had not changed. People had. By late winter, Frank realized something else. He had stopped counting days. He marked storms, not time. He planned improvements rather than escapes. The idea of returning to town felt distant, abstract, like a life he had already lived and finished. He had not found gold or documents worth money. He had found something rarer, a way of being that did not require approval. A rhythm shaped by attention rather than noise. He had found proof that the past was not foolish simply because it was forgotten. One afternoon, as sunlight struck the southern opening just right, Frank stood beside the ancient wall and rested his palm against the stone. Rex sat at his feet, ears forward, content. Below them, Durango lay quiet beneath snow, its laughter stilled, its curiosity awakened. Frank did not feel triumphant. He felt settled. He understood finally what Elias had meant, what his father had tried to teach without words. The mountain did not give treasures. It gave lessons. Shelter. Silence. A way to stay. Frank Walker had not come here to be remembered. He had come here to live. And in doing so, he had uncovered something far more valuable than anything buried. Sometimes what we call a miracle doesn't arrive as thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes it comes quietly through stone that holds warmth, through patience that outlasts ridicule, through a path that only makes sense after we've walked it long enough. God's work is often not about changing the mountain. It's about teaching us how to stand on it without fear. The wisdom hidden in these walls reminds us that the Creator placed order, balance, and provision into the world long before we learned how to listen. When we slow down, when we observe instead of rushing, When we choose humility over pride, we begin to see His guidance everywhere in nature, in hardship, and in the quiet strength it takes to keep going. In our everyday lives, we face winters too, moments when others laugh at our choices, times when the world tells us we are foolish for believing, for preparing, for walking a harder but truer path. Yet faith is often built exactly there in the silence, in the unseen work, in trusting that God sees what others do not. If this story spoke to you, let it be a reminder. You may not find gold where you stand today, but you may find wisdom. You may not feel applause, but you may feel peace. And that peace is never an accident. Before you go, share this story with someone who might need hope tonight. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, your city, your state, your country. Subscribe to the channel so these stories can keep reaching hearts across the world. And wherever you are, may God bless you, protect you, and keep you warm through every winter you face. May He guide your steps, strengthen your spirit, and remind you that even in silence you are never alone.